If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. The dangerous deal on Craigslist. I found the couch listing on Craigslist late one night while half-heartedly browsing for cheap furniture. My old futon was falling apart, and I couldn't believe my luck when I saw this sleek, modern couch for just $50. The seller, Tom, claimed he was moving out and needed it gone fast. I texted him, expecting the deal to fall through or be some kind of scam, but he replied almost immediately, sounding friendly enough. He mentioned he was in my area and could even help load the couch. I was a bit wary, but he assured me it was legit and that he lived alone. After a few back-and-forth messages, we set up a time the next day. I figured, why not? I asked my friend Jake to come along just to be safe, and he agreed. The next evening, Jake and I made our way to the address Tom had given. The neighborhood was a bit run down, and when we got to the building, it looked almost abandoned. Most of the windows were dark, and the entrance smelled musty, like it hadn't been used in ages. There were no other people around, which felt strange, but we shrugged it off, telling ourselves it was probably just a quiet area. We reached his floor and stood outside the door, waiting after I knocked. That's when we both heard it, a low, muffled voice coming from inside the apartment. I immediately felt uneasy, remembering Tom had said he lived alone. Jake looked at me, raising an eyebrow, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing. Something felt off. After a few seconds, the door creaked open, and Tom stood there. He looked normal enough, average build, a bit unshaven, maybe in his 30s. But something about his eyes felt wrong. They darted between Jake and me, sizing us up in a way that sent a chill down my spine. He forced a smile and waved us in, saying the couch was in the back room and that he'd need some help getting it through the narrow hallway. I hesitated, glancing at Jake, who looked just as uncomfortable as I felt. I tried to politely suggest maybe we could just see the couch first before committing to moving anything. But Tom's face hardened, and he insisted, almost snapping, "It'll only take a minute. Just come in." We both stepped back instinctively, mumbling some excuse about needing to grab something from the car. But as we turned to leave, his hand shot out, gripping the doorframe tightly. For a split second, it felt like he might actually try to block us from leaving. The weird tension between us was thick, and I felt my pulse racing, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. Without another word, I grabbed Jake's arm, and we quickly walked down the hallway, not daring to look back. As we reached the stairs, I swear I heard footsteps behind us, soft and creeping, like he was following us. When we finally hit the ground floor and burst out onto the street, we both looked at each other, rattled but grateful we'd gotten out. Once we got back to the car, we sat there in silence for a minute, catching our breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Jake was the first to speak, asking if I'd heard those voices inside the apartment. I nodded, my skin crawling as I replayed it in my head. It wasn't just Tom's voice we heard. There had been at least one other, maybe more, muffled and quiet, like people trying to talk without being overheard. And the way Tom acted when we hesitated, it didn't feel like normal impatience. It felt desperate, like he needed us in there. My mind raced with all kinds of horrible possibilities. I suggested calling the police, but Jake shook his head, reminding me we technically hadn't seen anything illegal. He said maybe it was just a weird vibe, but deep down, I could tell he was just as freaked out as I was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the dark, empty building, the look in Tom's eyes, and those voices. I finally grabbed my phone around 3 a.m. and decided to check Craigslist, half convinced I'd find some kind of explanation. But when I searched, the listing was gone, completely deleted. No trace of the couch, no contact info, nothing. It was as if it had never existed. I even tried to find our message thread, but it, too, had disappeared from my phone. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. I knew I hadn't imagined any of it, and I felt a sudden wave of panic realizing that Tom now had my number and knew my name. I ended up blocking his number, just to feel a bit safer, but I was far from reassured. Over the next few days, I tried to push the whole thing out of my mind, but I just couldn't shake it. Every time I thought back to that empty hallway or the sound of those footsteps behind us, I'd feel this gnawing sense of dread. Finally, out of curiosity, and maybe a little paranoia, I decided to look up the building online to see if I could find any reviews or history about it. When I typed in the address, though, what I found made my blood run cold. The building was listed as mostly vacant, marked for demolition in the coming months. Apparently, only a handful of units were ever rented out, and even those had been empty for a while. It dawned on me that nobody was actually living there. If that was true, then who the hell was Tom, and what was he doing in a deserted building? I told Jake what I'd found, and he was silent for a moment before admitting that he'd been having nightmares about it too. Both of us kept wondering what might have happened if we had actually stepped inside that apartment. The whole setup seemed too deliberate, like a trap we barely managed to avoid. I started obsessively checking Craigslist, hoping to catch another listing from Tom, but nothing ever came up. It was like he'd vanished along with the apartment. We even thought about going back, maybe just to see the place one more time, but the thought made me nauseous. We decided to let it go, but to this day, I sometimes wake up at night thinking about how easily we could have ended up as one of those stories people hear about. The ones where someone just disappears without a trace. A few weeks later, I got a random text from an unknown number. All it said was, "Did you like the couch?" My heart stopped. The message had no context, no signature, nothing that could be traced. My hands shook as I showed it to Jake, who immediately went pale. We both knew it was from Tom or whoever had been in that apartment. But how did he still have my number? I had blocked it, hadn't I? And worse, why was he texting now, weeks later? It felt like he was taunting us, like he knew we'd never figure out what really happened that night. I didn't reply, of course, and eventually deleted the message, but I spent days after that feeling paranoid, looking over my shoulder any time I was alone. Since then, I haven't been able to trust online listings the same way. Even years later, I still get this pit in my stomach when I think back on it. I don't know who Tom really was or what his plan was, but I'm certain of one thing. Whatever was waiting for us in that apartment, it wasn't just a couch. Part of me is grateful we left when we did, but another part is haunted by the not knowing. It's terrifying to think that someone out there could be planning something like that, setting traps for people who are just looking for a good deal. To this day, I don't know why we were chosen, or what might have happened if we hadn't trusted our gut. I just hope we were the last ones he tried it with. The silent neighbor. I had barely been in my new apartment for a week when I first noticed her, the elderly woman in the apartment next door. It was one of those older suburban complexes, where the buildings felt more like big houses split into sections. Quiet, charming enough, and way more affordable than I'd expected. The first time I saw her, she was just staring. She had this intense look, watching me through her window as I walked to my car. I tried smiling at her, assuming she was just one of those lonely types who like to people watch, but she didn't respond. Just kept her eyes fixed on me, like she was trying to memorize my face. After that, I'd spot her almost every day, always at odd times, like she knew exactly when I was coming or going. One evening, I came home from a late shift and found a note slipped under my door. My name was scribbled on it, but the handwriting was shaky, almost childlike, like someone struggling with a pen. It read, "Please come help me bring something." I immediately thought of the woman next door and felt a pang of guilt. Maybe she really was struggling and didn't have anyone else to ask. So, I decided to just knock on her door and see what she needed. When I got there, her door was cracked open, just slightly. I called out hello, but got no response. I hesitated, but then pushed the door open a bit more. The moment I stepped inside, something felt off. Her apartment was dark, almost suffocatingly so, and there was this stale, musty smell, like the place hadn't been aired out in years. I called out again, louder this time, "Hello? It's Emma from next door." But only silence answered me. I felt my skin prickle as I moved further in, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. The layout was identical to my apartment, but the atmosphere was all wrong, heavy, almost oppressive. I was about to turn back, thinking maybe she'd gone out, when something on the walls caught my eye. Photos. Dozens of them. All framed or pinned up in odd, uneven rows across her walls. I froze when I realized each one was of me. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. These weren't just random pictures either. They looked like they'd been taken secretly, from strange angles. There were shots of me unlocking my apartment door, walking down the hall, even sitting on my balcony, staring off into the distance. And then there were some that left me completely unnerved, photos of me in places I didn't recognize, but the dates written on them were recent. In one, I was standing outside some store at night, wearing a jacket I didn't own. Another showed me asleep in bed, though I had no memory of anyone ever being in my room. It felt impossible, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My hands started shaking, and I felt this overwhelming urge to get out of there immediately. Heart pounding, I backed away from the walls, desperate to get out of that place. But as I turned to leave, I noticed a soft creaking sound coming from deeper inside the apartment. My mind raced. I hadn't seen anyone in here, but that sound, it was like someone was shifting their weight, moving quietly in the shadows. I stood there, holding my breath, straining to hear any hint of movement. Nothing. I was about to convince myself it was just the building settling, or my own nerves playing tricks, when I saw something even worse. A small, framed picture sitting on a side table near the door. It was another photo of me, but this one was different. It showed me holding the note I'd just received under my door. That was the last straw. I practically bolted out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I rushed back to my place, locking the door as soon as I got in, my mind racing, my heart still pounding in my chest. I felt this crawling sense of dread, like I'd been watched for much longer than I even realized. Trying to calm myself down, I told myself I'd just ask the landlord about it in the morning. Maybe she was just eccentric, and somehow knew things about me without meaning any harm. But deep down, I knew there was no innocent explanation for what I'd seen. I barely slept that night, feeling like any second, I'd hear a knock on my door, or worse, find another note waiting for me. The next morning, I went straight to the landlord's office. I must have looked like a wreck because he raised an eyebrow as soon as he saw me. I asked him, as casually as I could, about the old woman living next door. He just stared at me, confused, and then said, "No one's rented that unit for over a year. It's empty." I felt my stomach drop. I told him I'd seen an elderly woman there multiple times, that she'd even left a note under my door. He insisted I must be mistaken, that the apartment had been vacant since the last tenant moved out and he hadn't even shown it to anyone yet. I argued with him, desperate to make sense of it all, but he just shrugged and said, "If you're seeing things, you might want to talk to someone about it." Leaving the office, I felt dizzy, like the whole world had shifted off balance. I returned to my apartment, pacing, trying to figure out what to do. I considered calling a friend or the police, but I knew how it would sound, like I'd imagined everything. As a last-ditch effort, I decided to check if the photos were still there. I crept over to her door, half expecting it to be locked tight, but it was cracked open, exactly as I'd left it. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. To my shock, the walls were bare. Every single photo was gone, the side table was empty, and the place had a strange, dusty stillness, like it hadn't been touched in ages. I stood there, frozen, trying to process the emptiness around me. It was as if the apartment itself had somehow erased all traces of her and everything I'd seen. My mind raced, replaying each photo in vivid detail. The shots of me, in places I didn't remember, the one of me holding the note. It all felt too real to just dismiss as a figment of my imagination. Yet there I was, staring at blank, dusty walls. I searched the room, even pulling open empty drawers and looking behind furniture, but there was nothing. No photos, no sign of life, nothing to prove that anyone had been there. I felt a suffocating panic creep up, a desperate feeling of helplessness. How could it all just vanish? I left the apartment in a daze, almost stumbling back to my place, feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little noise, every creak or thump in the walls set me on edge. I started double-checking my locks, barely sleeping, half expecting to find another note under my door each morning. But nothing happened. After a week of this, I went back to the landlord and practically begged him to check the building's records, to see if anyone had ever rented that unit recently. He finally caved, pulling out an old tenant file. The last tenant, he told me, was an elderly woman who had passed away over a year ago. Hearing that, something inside me just went cold. I asked him if there was any chance someone else could have been living there since then, maybe without him knowing, but he shook his head. He even showed me the key log, and the keys to that unit hadn't been used or loaned out since she passed. As I stared at the empty apartment door across the hall from mine, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. If no one had lived there, then who had been watching me all those times? Who left that note? And what about those photos? I had no answers, only questions that twisted and knotted in my mind, leaving me wondering if I'd ever truly be able to relax in my own home again. Since then, I've tried to put it all behind me, convincing myself it was some kind of stress-induced hallucination or a prank gone too far. But every now and then, I still feel eyes on me, like someone's watching from just out of sight. I've never seen the woman again, but there are nights when I wake up suddenly, heart racing, convinced that I'll find another note, or worse, another picture of me somewhere it shouldn't be. It's been months now, but even with the apartment door locked tight, I still sleep with one eye open, waiting, dreading that quiet, creeping feeling that she's still there, just beyond my reach. The night drive. I'm usually fine with late-night drives. They're quiet, almost peaceful. But that night was different from the start. I was coming back from a work thing, taking this long stretch of road that seemed to go on forever, barely a light or car in sight. Just me, the dark, and my headlights cutting through it. Somewhere along the way, I noticed headlights in my rear-view mirror. Nothing strange about that, but these lights kept creeping up, getting closer. At first, I figured they were just another driver trying to get home fast. But they stayed right on me, close enough that I could see the car behind me. An old, beat-up sedan. Weirdly, they'd flash their lights every so often. Just a quick flicker, but enough to grab my attention. I remember feeling my hands tighten on the wheel, that low hum of unease starting to kick in. After a few miles, I sped up, hoping to shake them, but they matched my speed, keeping the same tight distance. It was like they wanted me to know they were there. I could feel my chest tightening as I glanced back at the sedan, its headlights nearly blinding in my mirror. It wasn't just the weird flashing that got to me. It was the way they were so in sync with me, never trying to pass, just staying close, watching. I started to think of every possibility. Maybe it was someone I'd cut off without realizing it, or some jerk looking for a thrill. But it didn't feel like that. I was trying to rationalize it, but in the pit of my stomach, there was this nagging feeling that something was off, something I couldn't explain. After a few more miles of this silent chase, I couldn't take it anymore. I saw the glow of a gas station up ahead, the first sign of life I'd seen in ages, so I decided to pull over. As I slowed down and signaled to turn, I expected the car behind me to pass by. But instead, they slowed down too, hanging back just enough to stay out of the light from the gas station. My heart was pounding as I pulled into the station. I parked right under one of the floodlights, hoping the brightness would give me some relief, but all it did was make the shadows around the place feel darker. When I looked back, the car had stopped a bit down the road, just idling in the shadows. I couldn't see inside, couldn't even make out a silhouette through the windows. It was like they wanted me to know they were there, but didn't want me to see who they were. I went inside the gas station, trying to act casual, but I must have looked rattled because the attendant gave me a strange look. After grabbing a water and some gum, I asked him if he'd noticed the car parked down the road. He glanced out the window, his expression shifting just slightly, and then he shrugged in a way that wasn't exactly reassuring. "That car," he said, almost like he'd been expecting me to ask. "It's been showing up a lot lately, always following people late at night. But no one ever sees who's driving it. It just fades away after a while." Hearing that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to brush it off as some weird prank or urban legend, but the way the attendant said it, with this flat, almost bored tone, felt unsettling, like it was just another part of his routine. I stepped back outside, hoping that maybe, finally, the car would be gone. But no, it was still there, headlights dimmed but the engine quietly idling. I considered walking over, but something held me back. There was this heavy silence in the air, broken only by the hum of the station lights and the distant, barely audible purr of the engine. I stood there, my skin crawling, debating what to do next. Every instinct was telling me not to engage, just to get back in my car and leave. I got into my car, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself it was probably nothing, just someone messing around. As I pulled out of the station, I glanced back and saw the car start moving too. This time, it didn't follow directly behind me but kept its distance, just far enough back that I could barely see the headlights in my rear view. I tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the road and convince myself that the whole thing was just random. But even after I got off the main road and closer to my neighborhood, the car kept its distance, lurking in the dark. Every time I thought it was gone, I'd catch a flash of those headlights just out of sight, almost like it was waiting for me to let my guard down. When I finally reached my street, I felt this strange mix of relief and dread. My house was just around the corner, but the idea of stopping, of getting out while that car was still somewhere behind me, made my skin crawl. I drove past my house at first, just to see if it would follow me all the way up to my driveway. And sure enough, I saw those headlights appear again, just far enough to keep me on edge. That was it. I wasn't going to lead this thing straight to my front door. I took another turn, looping through a few streets until finally, when I looked back, there was no sign of the car. After a minute or two, I was convinced it had given up or lost track of me. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the nerves, and headed back toward home. As I parked and stepped out of the car, the silence of my empty street felt almost too quiet, like the air was holding its breath. I was exhausted, nerves frayed, but I managed to make it inside, double-locking the door behind me. I tried to laugh it off, thinking I just had a run-in with some bored creep or maybe just spooked myself over nothing. But later, as I was finally unwinding, I heard it, that same low, persistent sound. I froze, my heart pounding, straining to listen. From somewhere outside, the faint hum of an engine idling drifted into the silence, soft but unmistakable. I crept to the window, feeling that same chill from the gas station crawl back over me. Peeking out, I saw nothing. The street was empty. I stood there, staring out into the darkness, my eyes darting across every shadow, every corner of the street, waiting for something to move, for those headlights to reappear. But there was just nothing. Only the sound of that engine still hanging in the air, steady and close, like it was right outside my house. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe the whole drive had gotten into my head. But the hum kept going, and the more I listened, the more certain I was. It was coming from right in front of my house, though I couldn't see a single car. After a few minutes, the sound just stopped, cutting off so suddenly it left a ringing in my ears. I waited a moment longer, holding my breath, but the silence was complete. I tried to shake it off and go to bed, but sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear an echo of that idling engine, that steady hum, like it was still out there, waiting. Even now, sometimes late at night, I'll think I hear it faintly in the distance. I'll check the street, but there's never anything there. I still don't know who or what was in that car, but whatever it was, I feel like it was looking for something. Or maybe it found it.